Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales, where the vast, silent prairies can turn into a theater of tragedy in the blink of an eye, and where survival depends not just on strength, but on the courage to trust. Settle in and listen to a tale of devastating loss, of a soul pushed to the brink of despair in the lonely dark, and of a wise and relentless hunter who follows the faintest of trails, seeking not vengeance, but life. The Oregon Trail was a river of dust, a slow, meandering current of hope and hardship flowing west. For weeks, the world for 17-year-old Daniel Miller had been reduced to the rhythmic creak of wagon wheels, the weary lowing of the oxen, and the vast, unending canvas of the Wyoming sky. It was a world of profound, soul-crushing boredom punctuated by moments of stark, breathtaking beauty. A herd of pronghorn antelope flowing like a golden wave over a distant hill, the violet shadows that filled the canyons at dusk, the impossible, diamond-bright clarity of the stars in the moonless night. Daniel, his younger sister, 8-year-old Lily, and their parents were part of the Miller-Donovan wagon train, a small, hopeful convoy of 6 families seeking a new life in the fertile valleys of Oregon. They were not seasoned pioneers, but farmers and shopkeepers from Ohio, trading the familiar green of their homeland for a dream of land and opportunity. Daniel's father, a gentle, scholarly man who seemed more suited to a library than a prairie, was the train's elected captain, a role he accepted with a quiet, solemn sense of duty. On this particular afternoon, a sense of profound unease had settled over the train. They were traveling through a stretch of broken, rocky country, a series of low buttes and shallow, winding canyons that offered 1,000 perfect places for an ambush. The air was unnaturally still, the usual drone of insects silenced. Even the birds had stopped singing. The vast, open prairie, which had felt lonely but safe, had been replaced by a landscape that felt claustrophobic and watchful. "I don't like it, John," Daniel heard his mother murmur to his father, her hand tightening on the rifle she kept by her seat on the wagon. "It feels wrong." His father placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're just spooked by the terrain, Harry. We'll be through it by sundown and back in the open plains." But his father was wrong. The attack came without a sound of warning. There was no war cry, no thunder of hoofbeats. There was only the sudden, sharp walk of an arrow burying itself in the wooden side of the lead wagon, followed an instant later by a deafening, rolling volley of rifle fire that erupted from the rocks on both sides of the trail. The world dissolved into pure, terrifying chaos. Oxen screamed and collapsed in their yokes, their massive bodies thrashing. Men shouted, their voices a mixture of surprise and agony. Women and children screamed, a high, piercing sound of pure terror that was almost worse than the gunfire. Gunsmoke, thick and acrid, filled the air, obscuring the unseen enemy, turning the familiar scene of the wagon train into a hazy, nightmarish battlefield. Daniel, who had been walking alongside his family's wagon, was thrown to the ground by the sheer force of the first volley. He looked up, his ears ringing, and saw his father standing on the wagon seat, his old hunting rifle in his hand, trying to rally a defense. "To the wagons! Circle up!" he yelled, his voice a beacon of calm in the maelstrom. It was the last thing Daniel ever heard him say. A bullet struck his father in the chest, throwing him backwards into the wagon bed with a final, surprised grunt. Daniel's mother screamed his name, a sound of such raw, soul-shattering anguish that it would haunt Daniel's dreams for the rest of his life. She raised her own rifle, but before she could fire, another shot rang out, and she slumped forward over the wagon seat. Time seemed to stop. Daniel stared, his mind refusing to process the impossible, brutal reality of what he had just seen. His parents, his entire world, gone in the space of 2 heartbeats. From inside the wagon, Lily began to scream, a terrified, unceasing wail. The sound broke Daniel's paralysis. He scrambled to his feet, his only thought to get to his sister. He lunged for the back of the wagon, just as the attackers, a band of what looked like white outlaws dressed in a motley collection of stolen and scavenged gear, swarmed down from the rocks. They were not warriors, they were vultures, their faces grim and cruel, their eyes holding nothing but a cold, predatory greed. They moved with a brutal efficiency, shooting anyone who still moved, their focus entirely on the plunder of the wagons. A large, bearded outlaw grabbed Daniel by the collar, his breath a foul stench of whiskey and rot. He raised a pistol to press against Daniel's forehead. "Well, what have we here?" the man sneered. Suddenly, from behind them, the canvas flap of the wagon was ripped open. Lily, her small face streaked with tears and soot, stood there, holding their father's heavy cold revolver in both her trembling hands. With a desperate, feral scream, she pulled the trigger. The gun bucked wildly, the shot going wide, but it was enough. The outlaw, startled, cursed and turned, swatting the gun from her hands. In that split second of distraction, Daniel acted. Driven by a pure, primal instinct he didn't know he possessed, he slammed his head forward into the outlaw's face. There was a satisfying crunch of cartilage, and the man howled, staggering back, blood pouring from his broken nose. "Lily, run!" Daniel screamed, shoving her out of the back of the wagon. "Into the rocks? Go?" He turned to follow her, but another outlaw was on him, the butt of a rifle catching him high on the temple. The world exploded in a flash of white-hot pain, and he fell into a black, suffocating abyss. He didn't know how long he was unconscious. It could have been minutes or an hour. He awoke to a horrifying and natural silence. The gunfire had stopped. The screaming had stopped. The only sounds were the crackle of flames the outlaws had set fire to the wagons and the low, pain moaning of a few dying oxen. He pushed himself up, his head a universe of throbbing pain. The scene before him was a tableau from hell. The bodies of his friends and neighbors lay scattered among the burning wreckage of their homes, their dreams turned to ash and smoke. The outlaws were gone, having taken the horses, the cattle, and anything else of value. They had left nothing behind but death and destruction. Grief, so profound and absolute it was a physical force, threatened to paralyze him. But then, a single, desperate thought cut through the haze of his pain. Lily. He scrambled to his feet, his vision swimming. "Lily," he cried, his voice a raw, broken croak. "Lily, where are you?" He searched frantically among the bodies and the wreckage, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He didn't find her. There was no sign of her small body. The outlaws must have taken her. The thought was a new, sharper kind of agony. Or had she escaped? Had she followed his command and run into the rocks? A tiny, desperate sliver of hope ignited in his soul. He had to believe she had gotten away. He stumbled away from the smoking funeral pyre of the wagon train and towards the jumble of rocks and canyons that flanked the trail. He was weak, wounded, his mind a fractured mess of grief and shock. He called her name until his throat was raw, but the only answer was the mocking echo of his own voice. As dusk began to settle, a cold, drizzling rain began to fall, turning the dust to a slick, greasy mud. He was shivering, his clothes soaked, his strength failing. He knew he couldn't stay out in the open. The outlaws might come back, or the wolves, drawn by the scent of death, would soon arrive. He needed shelter. He stumbled into a narrow, winding wash, the high, rocky walls offering some protection from the wind and rain. He followed it, his feet slipping and sliding in the mud, his only thought to put as much distance as possible between himself and the massacre. Just as he felt he could not take another step, he saw it. A dark, gaping shadow in the rock face, partially hidden by a curtain of thorny vines. A cave. With the last of his strength, he clawed his way through the vines and collapsed onto the dry, dusty floor of the small cavern. He was safe, for now. But as he lay there in the cold, absolute darkness, the full, crushing weight of his reality descended upon him. He was alone, a 17-year-old boy, wounded and unarmed, in the middle of a vast and forgiving wilderness. His family was dead. His sister was gone. The hope that had carried him across a continent was extinguished, leaving behind nothing but the cold, empty darkness of the cave and the echoing screams of his memory. The cave was not a sanctuary, it was a tomb. It was a pocket of absolute blackness, a silence so profound that Daniel could hear the frantic, terrified thumping of his own heart, and the ragged, shuddering sound of his own breathing. He lay on the cold stone floor, curled into a tight, fetal ball, a posture of pure, primal self-preservation. The physical world had shrunk to the confines of this dark, damp space, but his internal world was a vast, raging inferno of grief, terror, and guilt. The images played in his mind on a repeating, merciless loop. His father, falling. His mother, slumping forward. The sneer on the outlaw's face. Lily's terrified scream. His last, desperate command for her to run. Had he saved her, or had he sent her to a different, lonelier death out in the wilderness? The question was a form of torture, a razor-sharp blade of uncertainty that carved away at his sanity. He had failed them. He was the man of the family now, and he had failed them all in the first, brutal test of that mantle. When the first rays of dawn finally filtered into the cave, a weak, gray light that did little to dispel the gloom, they revealed the true nature of his prison. It was a small, shallow cavern, little more than a deep overhang, with a floor of fine dust and a ceiling that wept a slow, steady drip of cold, mineral-tasting water into a small puddle in the corner. The walls were slick with moisture and covered in a pale, ghostly fungus. It was a place that had not known the warmth of the sun in 1,000 years. The first day was a blur of shock and sorrow. Daniel did not move from his spot. He didn't feel the gnawing emptiness in his stomach or the parched, cracking dryness of his lips. He was numb, a hollow shell of a boy, rocking back and forth in the half-light, his arms wrapped around his knees as if to hold the fractured pieces of himself together. The world outside the cave with birds, the wind, the sun did not exist. The only reality was the massacre, the echoing finality of the gunshots, the smell of smoke and blood. By the second day, the raw, demanding needs of his body began to break through the fog of his grief. A fierce, cramping hunger twisted his gut. Thirst was a fire in his throat. The dull, throbbing ache in his head from the rifle butt had sharpened into a piercing, relentless migraine. He crawled on his hands and knees to the small, muddy puddle in the corner and drank the icy, metallic water. It was the most wonderful and most disgusting thing he had ever tasted. It was the taste of survival, and a part of him hated it. To survive felt like a betrayal of his family, who had not. The cave that had been his refuge now became his cage. The loneliness was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that threatened to suffocate him. He would talk to himself in hoarse whispers, just to hear the sound of a human voice. He would call out Lily's name, the sound swallowed by the damp stone, the silence that answered a fresh, painful wound. Fear was his constant companion. At night, the darkness was absolute, and every sound from the outside world was magnified into a terrifying threat. The howl of a distant coyote became a wolf pack, circling his hiding place. The scrape of a rock dislodged by the wind became the sound of one of the outlaws, returning to finish the job. He would huddle in the deepest part of the cave, his eyes wide and unseeing, his body trembling, waiting for the teeth or the bullet that would end his miserable existence. By the third day, despair began to set in, a cold, creeping numbness that was more dangerous than the fear. The desperate hope that Lily had somehow survived was dwindling, replaced by a grim, soul-crushing certainty that she was gone. What was the point of his own survival? To wander this wasteland alone until he starved or was found by the men who had murdered his family. The thought of leaving the cave was as terrifying as the thought of staying in it. He was paralyzed by a perfect equilibrium of terror and hopelessness. His memories, which had been a source of agonizing grief, now became his only solace. He would close his eyes and retreat into the past, to the green, rolling hills of their Ohio farm. He remembered his father teaching him how to read, his patient voice explaining the magical worlds trapped in the pages of a book. He remembered his mother's warm, flour-dusted hands as she taught him how to bake bread, her easy laughter filling the kitchen. He remembered chasing Lily through a field of wildflowers, her pigtails flying, her shrieks of delight the most joyful sound in the world. These memories were all he had left, fragile, beautiful ghosts in the darkness of his stone prison. On the fourth day, he was startled from a feverish doze by a new sound. It was a low, guttural growl, coming from the mouth of the cave. Daniel froze, his blood turning to ice. It was a deep, menacing sound, the sound of a large predator. A bear. A mountain lion. He pressed himself flat against the back wall, trying to make himself as small as possible. His breath caught in his throat. A large, dark shape blotted out the light from the entrance. It was a wolf, a massive gray wolf, its yellow eyes glowing in the gloom. It stood there for a long moment, its nose twitching, tasting the air, smelling the strange, human scent within. It took a tentative step inside, its lips curling back to reveal a set of long, yellow fangs. This was it. The end. After all he had endured, he was going to be torn apart by a wild animal. A strange sense of calm washed over him. He was too weak to fight, too tired to run. He closed his eyes, his mother's smiling face the last image in his mind. He waited, but the attack never came. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, he heard a soft whine and the scrape of clothes on rock as the wolf backed out of the cave. He dared to open his eyes. The wolf was gone. Why? Why had it spared him? Had he seemed too pathetic, too weak to even be considered a threat or a meal? Or was it something else? A moment of inexplicable, wild mercy. The encounter, as terrifying as it was, broke his paralysis. It was a sign. The world had not entirely given him up for dead. He had been spared, by both man and beast. For what purpose? He did not know. But he could not simply lie here and wait to die. He had to do something. He had to live. If not for himself, then for the memory of his family. He had to live because they could not. With a surge of newfound, desperate resolve, Daniel pushed himself to his feet, swaying from weakness and hunger. He looked out of the mouth of the cave at the sun-drenched, indifferent world. He was still alone. He was still trapped. But he was no longer a victim waiting for the end. He was a survivor. And his first, faltering step out of the darkness of the cave was a declaration of war against the despair that had almost claimed him. Far to the north of Daniel's lonely cave, in a hidden valley where the high plains met the foothills of the Bighorn Mountains, a man named Nokosi sat by his fire. He was Cheyenne, a man whose age was impossible to guess. His face was a roadmap of the wind and the sun, a testament to a life lived under the open sky. But his eyes, dark and sharp as a hawk's, held the keen, piercing intelligence of a young man. His long black hair, streaked with silver at the temples, was tied back into simple braids. He was a man who seemed to be a part of the landscape itself, as quiet and enduring as the ancient rocks that surrounded his camp. Nokosi was a man who walked between two worlds. He held to the old ways of his people, his spirit in tune with the rhythms of the earth, the whispers of the wind, and the language of the animals. But he also understood the changing world of the Vehoe, the white man. He spoke their language, understood their strange obsessions with squared-off land and yellow metal, and he traded with them, acting as a scout and a guide for those few he deemed worthy of his trust. He was a hunter, but what he hunted was not always game. He was a finder of lost things, a reader of broken trails. He was a seeker of balance in a world that was rapidly falling out of it. He had been tracking a small herd of elk for 2 days when he first saw the smoke. It was a thick, black pillar, rising from the south, a greasy, ugly stain against the pure blue of the sky. It was not the smoke of a campfire or a signal fire. It was the smoke of a great and terrible burning, a funeral pyre on the prairie. It was a sign of violence, a disruption of the natural order. His hunt for the elk was forgotten. A new, more somber hunt had begun. It took him a day and a half of hard riding on his sturdy paint pony to reach the source of the smoke. He found the Massacre site on the old Oregon Trail just as the sun was setting. He dismounted a short distance away, his expression grim, his heart heavy. He had seen scenes like this before, too many times. It was the brutal, ugly signature of the New Age. He did not rush in. He approached the site with a quiet, solemn reverence, his eyes taking in every detail. The scene was a chaotic jumble of burned-out wagons, the bloated carcasses of oxen, and the still, silent forms of the pioneers. Vultures and coyotes had already been at work, and Nokosi's face hardened at the desecration. He walked through the wreckage, his gaze missing nothing. This was not a battlefield, it was a crime scene, and he was its only detective. He read the story of the attack in the ashes and the dust. He saw where the attackers had hidden in the rocks, the scattered rifle casings telling him they used modern, repeating rifles. He saw by the tracks that they were shod horses, ridden by white men. He saw by the way the goods were plundered and food and tools left behind, the personal trunks broken open and rifled through that they were not just killing for supplies. They were searching for something specific. He knelt by the bodies of John and Mary Miller, his expression one of profound sadness. He had met this family. 2 weeks prior, he had traded with their wagon train, exchanging fresh deer meat for flour and coffee. He remembered the man, John, with his kind, scholarly eyes, and the woman, Mary, with her quiet strength. He remembered their 2 children, a small, bright-eyed girl and a thoughtful, serious boy who had watched him with a shy curiosity. He searched the site for the children's bodies. He did not find them. His hunter's mind began to work, sifting through the possibilities. They could have been burned beyond recognition in the wagons, but his instincts told him otherwise. They could have been taken captive. Or they could have escaped. He began to circle the site, his eyes scanning the ground, searching for any sign, any track that led away from the central chaos. The rain from a few days prior had washed away most of the tracks, turning the ground into a muddy, confusing mess. But Nokosi was a master of his craft. He did not just look for footprints. He looked for the subtle language of the earth. A bruised blade of grass, a pebble turned over to show its darker, damp side, a broken stem of sagebrush. He found it, at the eastern edge of the site. A single, small, scuffed track in the mud, leading away from the carnage and towards the rocky butts. It was the track of a boy's boot. He was sure of it, made in a desperate, running scramble. And beside it, an even smaller, fainter set of tracks. The girl. So, they had run. Together. His heart, which had been heavy with grief, now felt a flicker of hope. He followed the trail. It was agonizingly slow work. The tracks were faint, scattered. He could see where they had split, the girl's tracks vanishing into a confusing jumble of rocks, the boy's continuing on alone, stumbling, weaving. The boy was wounded, he realized. The tracks told a story of pain and desperation. For 2 days, Nokosi followed the broken trail. He was relentless, a patient, tireless hunter on the trail of the most precious game of all, a human life. He moved with a quiet, efficient grace, his paint pony following him like a loyal dog. He lived off the land, chewing on dried meat from his pouch, his senses alive to every nuance of the world around him. He saw where the boy had fallen, the small patch of blood-soaked earth. He saw where he had rested, the faint impression of a body in the shelter of a rock. The trail was growing colder, fainter. The boy was growing weaker. Nokosi knew he was in a race against time. On the 3rd day, the trail led him into a narrow, winding wash. The tracks were clearer here, protected from the wind. He could see the boy was stumbling badly now, his steps dragging. The trail led to a curtain of thorny vines against the rock face. The vines were broken, a few fresh scratches on the rock around them. The boy had gone inside. Nokosi dismounted, his expression a mixture of relief and caution. He approached the cave mouth silently. He could smell the faint, stale scent of human occupation. He stood for a long moment, listening. He heard nothing. No breathing, no movement. A cold dread began to creep into his heart. Was he too late? He called out, not in English, but in the soft, guttural consonants of his own Cheyenne tongue. It was a gentle sound, a question, not a challenge. Is anyone there? There was no answer. He pushed aside the vines and peered into the darkness. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust. Then he saw him. A thin, pale boy, huddled against the far wall, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and delirium. He was little more than a skeleton, his face hollowed out by hunger and grief. But he was alive. Nokosi's stoic expression softened with a profound, quiet relief. He had found him. The hunt was over. He had followed the faintest of trails to the darkest of places, and he had found the last, flickering ember of the Miller-Donovan wagon train. Now, the new, more difficult task began, to coax that ember back into a flame. The meeting in the cave was a fragile, terrifying moment suspended between two worlds. For Daniel, who had been living in a waking nightmare, the appearance of the Cheyenne hunter was so surreal, so impossible, that he was not entirely sure it was real. He stared at the figure silhouetted against the cave mouth, his fevered mind struggling to categorize him. Was he a spirit, a hallucination born of hunger and despair? Or was he another threat, a new and more terrifying monster emerging from the wilderness? Nokosi, for his part, understood the boy's terror. He had seen that look before in the eyes of cornered animals and traumatized men. He knew that any sudden move, any loud word, could shatter the boy's fragile psyche completely. He remained perfectly still, a calming, non-threatening presence, allowing the boy to simply look at him, to process his existence. After a long, silent moment, Nokosi knelt, making himself smaller, less intimidating. He reached for the water skin at his hip and stoppered it, and placed it gently on the ground, just inside the cave. He then pushed it slowly across the dusty floor towards Daniel. He did not speak. The gesture, universal and profound, spoke for him. I am not a threat. I am here to help. Here is life. Daniel watched the waterskin slide towards him, his eyes wide and unblinking. His thirst was a raging fire in his throat, a primal, undeniable need that overrode even his fear. Slowly, hesitantly, like a wild creature approaching a baited trap, he reached out a trembling hand. His fingers brushed against the cool, damp leather. It was real. This was real. He snatched the waterskin and scuttled back to the safety of the far wall, his eyes never leaving Nokosi. He drank, the water a shocking, life-giving miracle. He drank too much, too fast, and choked, the water spilling down his chin and onto his ragged shirt. But it was the first step back towards the world of the living. Seeing that the boy had accepted the water, Nokosi finally spoke, his voice low and soft, the English words careful and deliberate. "You are safe. The boy from the Miller wagon. I have looked for you." The sound of a human voice, calm and rational, was almost as shocking as the water. Daniel lowered the waterskin, his eyes filled with a dawning, bewildered hope. You know my name," he rasped, his own voice a dry and used croak. "I do not know your name," Nokosi replied gently. "But I know your father, John Miller. A good man. He traded with me. I am Nokosi." The mention of his father's name brought a fresh, painful wave of grief. Tears, hot and silent, welled in Daniel's eyes and began to trace paths through the grime on his cheeks. But mixed with the grief was a profound sense of relief. This man was not one of them. He was a friend. "My sister," Daniel whispered, the word a ragged prayer. "Lily. Did you find her? Is she?" He couldn't finish the question. Nokosi's expression softened with a deep, compassionate sadness. "I found her tracks, with yours," he said, choosing his words with care. "They led away from the wagons. But then they vanished. I do not know where she went." The trail was washed away. He did not offer false hope, only the hard and varnished truth. The girl was gone, her fate an unknown, a terrible question mark hanging over the desolation of the massacre. The faint ember of hope in Daniel's heart for Lily's survival flickered, but it did not die completely. She had run. That was something. Nokosi could see that the boy was at the very edge of his endurance, physically and emotionally. He reached into a pouch at his belt and took out a piece of pemmican, a dense, nutrient-rich cake of dried meat, berries, and fat. "Eat," he said, placing it on the ground where the waterskin had been. "Slowly, a little at a time. Your stomach has been empty for too long." Over the next few hours, Nokosi patiently, quietly, coaxed Daniel back from the brink. He did not press him with questions. He did not overwhelm him with pity. He simply provided for his basic, essential needs: water, food, and the profound comfort of a calm, steady human presence. He built a small, smokeless fire just outside the mouth of the cave, the warmth and light a welcome intrusion into the perpetual gloom. He heated some water and, using a clean cloth, gently washed the grime from Daniel's face and the matted blood from the wound on his temple. Each action was a small, deliberate thread, stitching the boy's shattered world back together. As the sun began to set, casting long, peaceful shadows, Daniel, wrapped in a warm wool blanket from Nokosi's betrayal, finally found the strength to tell his story. In a low, halting voice, punctuated by long, shuddering breaths, he recounted the horror of the attack, the murder of his parents, his desperate escape, and the lonely, terrifying days in the cave. Nokosi listened in complete and wavering silence, his dark eyes never leaving the boy's face. He did not interrupt. He did not judge. He simply listened, his presence a safe, solid anchor for the boy's terrible story. He was a vessel, holding the weight of Daniel's grief and trauma, allowing him to finally release it. When Daniel finished, a profound, exhausted silence fell between them. The fire crackled, a small, defiant sound in the vast stillness of the wilderness. "The men who did this," Nokosi said at last, his voice a low, hard rumble, like distant thunder. "They were led by a man with a tattoo on his hand, a red scorpion." Daniel looked up, his eyes widening. He had seen it. The big, bearded outlaw who had grabbed him just before Lily had fired the gun. On the back of his hand, there had been a crude, faded tattoo of a scorpion, its tail curled, ready to strike. "You know them," Daniel whispered. "I know of them," Nokosi said, his gaze turning to the fire, his expression hardening into a mask of cold anger. "The red scorpions. A plague on this land. They are not warriors. They are not hunters. They are coyotes who have forgotten how to fear the wolf. They kill for sport and for greed. He paused, a new, dangerous light entering his eyes. And they have stolen something that does not belong to them. The horses, the supplies, Daniel began. More than that, Nokosi interrupted. Your father, when I traded with him, he showed me something. He was very proud. It was a map. An old Spanish map, he said. It showed the location of a place his family had owned a deed to for many years. A valley, in Oregon, with a river of gold. He was not seeking fortune, your father. He was seeking a legal claim to a piece of land that was his heritage. The Scorpions must have heard of this map. That is what they were searching for. That is why they killed everyone. The story was a revelation. The senseless, brutal massacre now had a motive, a cold, greedy logic that was somehow even more chilling. They will not stop, Nokosi continued, his voice grim. They have the map. But they will know that you and your sister saw their faces. They cannot afford to leave witnesses. They will be hunting for you. The fragile sense of safety Daniel had begun to feel evaporated. He had been rescued from the cave, but he had only been moved from one prison to another, larger one. The entire wilderness was now his cage, and the hunters were still out there. Nokosi looked at the boy, at the fear and despair that were once again clouding his eyes. You have two choices, he said, his voice firm, pulling Daniel from his spiral of fear. You can let the fear consume you. You can let the grief break you. Or, you can stand up. You can honor the memory of your father, who was a brave man, and your mother, who was a strong woman. You can choose to live. The path ahead is dangerous, but you will not walk it alone. He stood and looked out at the star-dusted sky. Rest now, he said. Tomorrow, our journey begins. We will find a safe place for you. And then, we will see that the balance is restored. In the Cheyenne way, there was no word for revenge. There was only the concept of balance. When a great wrong had been committed, the world was thrown out of harmony. To hunt the men who had done this was not an act of vengeance. It was an act of healing, a necessary, dangerous ritual to set the world right again. And Daniel, huddled in the warm blanket, the first real food in his stomach, felt a new and familiar feeling ignite within him. It was not hope, not yet. It was something harder, something forged in the fires of his loss. It was purpose. His journey of survival was over. Now, a new journey was about to begin. Leaving the cave was like being born again into a world that was both familiar and terrifyingly alien. The sun on Daniel's skin, the whisper of the wind in the sparse pines, the vast, open sky, these were all sensations he had once taken for granted, but they now felt sharp, new, and overwhelming. He was weak, his legs unsteady after days of inactivity, but Nokosi was a patient guide. He adjusted the stirrups on his paint pony, a sturdy, intelligent animal, so that Daniel could ride while Nokosi walked alongside, his long, easy strides eating up the miles. Their journey was a slow, deliberate movement through the raw and tame beauty of the Wyoming territory. Nokosi did not take the easy paths. He avoided the open plains and the established trails, keeping instead to the broken country, the hidden arroyos, and the shadowed foothills where they were less likely to be seen. He was a ghost, and he was teaching Daniel how to become one, too. The first few days were a silent apprenticeship. Nokosi was a man of few words, but he was a masterful teacher. He taught Daniel not through lectures, but through action and observation. He showed him how to read the land, to see the subtle signs that Daniel had been blind to his entire life. A patch of nervous prairie dogs meant a predator or man was nearby. The type of clouds gathering over the mountains could predict the weather a day in advance. A particular type of willow tree always grew near a source of underground water. He taught Daniel how to find food where it seemed none existed. The tender, inner core of a yucca plant, the protein-rich grubs found under a rotting log, the small, tough berries that grew on a thorny bush. He showed him how to build a snare from a strip of rawhide, and Daniel felt a surge of profound, primal satisfaction when they returned one morning to find a fat rabbit caught in his first clumsy attempt. It was a small victory, but in this new, brutal world, small victories were all that kept the despair at bay. Most importantly, Nokosi taught him how to be quiet, how to move through the world without leaving a scar upon it. He taught him to walk heel to toe, to use the contours of the land for cover, to listen more than he spoke. Daniel, the boy who had loved the loud, bustling world of books and towns, was slowly, painstakingly, being remade into a creature of the silent, watchful wilderness. Their conversations, when they happened, were sparse and meaningful. In the evenings, by the light of a small, carefully concealed fire, Nokosi would sometimes share stories of his people, of the great buffalo hunts, of the spirits that lived in the rocks and the rivers. He spoke of the world as a living, breathing thing, a place of harmony and balance that was being torn apart by the greed of the new men. Daniel, in turn, found himself able to speak of his family, not with the raw, choking grief of the first days, but with a quiet, aching nostalgia. He told Nokosi about his father's love of poetry, his mother's incredible kindness, and Lily's mischievous, irrepressible spirit. In sharing his memories, he was ensuring that they did not die with him. Nokosi would listen, his dark eyes thoughtful, and would often respond with a simple Cheyenne proverb that seemed to hold a universe of wisdom. "A man is not dead," he said one night, after Daniel had spoken of his father, "as long as his name is still spoken." The bond between them grew, a silent, powerful connection forged in their shared solitude and their unspoken, shared purpose. Daniel began to see Nokosi not just as a rescuer, but as a mentor, a protector, and the only family he had left. Nokosi, who had lost his own wife and son years ago to a cholera epidemic, saw in Daniel not just a boy to be saved, but a spirit to be nurtured, a reason to engage with a world from which he had long felt disconnected. Their journey was not without its dangers. One afternoon, as they were resting in the shade of a rocky outcrop, Nokosi suddenly stiffened, holding up a hand for silence. He pointed to a ridge a half-mile away. Daniel looked and saw a plume of dust rising into the air. A few moments later, a group of riders came into view. There were 5 of them, riding hard, their rifles held ready. They were dressed in the same motley, careless way as the men who had attacked the wagon train. "Scorpions," Nokosi breathed, his voice a low, dangerous hiss. He pulled Daniel and the horse deeper into the shadows of the rocks. "They are casting a wide net, looking for any sign of you." They remained hidden, their hearts pounding, as the riders passed by, thankfully without spotting them. The sight of the men, the casual, confident way they rode, sent a fresh wave of cold fury through Daniel. They were hunting him as if he were an animal, the last loose end in their bloody, profitable venture. "We cannot keep running forever," Daniel said, his voice low and tight with a newfound hardness, after the riders were gone. "No," Nokosi agreed, his eyes dark and thoughtful. "Running is the tactic of the prey. To survive, we must become the predators. But we are only 2. And a predator must be wise. It must choose its moment to strike." He told Daniel of his plan. There was a trading post called 3 Rivers, about a week's ride to the north. It was a neutral ground, a place where trappers, traders, soldiers, and even warriors from different tribes came to trade. It was run by a French-Canadian man named Beau Dubois, a man Nokosi had known for many years and trusted. "We will be safe there," Nokosi explained. "And it is a place of many ears. We can listen to the whispers on the wind. We can learn where the scorpions have their lair, how many they are, who their leader is. A hunter does not charge blindly into the darkness. He first learns the shape of the beast he is hunting." The plan gave Daniel a tangible goal, a direction for his anger and his grief. He was no longer just a survivor, being led to safety. He was a hunter, being led to a place where he could learn the art of his new, terrible trade. Their trail was no longer a trail of escape. It was a trail of purpose, leading them towards a confrontation that was as inevitable as the rising of the sun. They were 2 disparate souls, a grieving boy from Ohio and a wise Cheyenne hunter, bound together by tragedy, and they were walking a new trail now. A trail that they both knew could only end in a final, bloody restoration of balance. 3 Rivers Trading Post was not a town. It was an island of rough-hewn civilization in a vast and forgiving sea of wilderness. It consisted of a single, long, low-slung building made of sod and timber, a sturdy corral, and a collection of teepees and canvas tents, all huddled in the fork of 2 rushing, snow-fed rivers. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, tan hides, and brewing coffee, a chaotic but comforting aroma of life and commerce. It was a place of astonishing diversity and barely concealed tension. Grizzled, Buckskin-clad mountain men with eyes as wild as the country they roamed haggled with shrewd company traders in dark, vested suits. A stoic delegation of Crow warriors, their faces painted for trade, watched with silent contempt as a group of boisterous, blue-coated soldiers from a nearby fort drank whiskey at a makeshift bar. It was a place where a man could get a fair price for his beaver pelts, a hot meal, a bottle of rot-gut whiskey, and a knife in the back, all in the same afternoon. Daniel, riding into this chaotic swirl of humanity beside Nokosi, felt a profound culture shock. After weeks of silent solitude in the wilderness, the sheer noise and number of people were overwhelming. He felt exposed, vulnerable, his senses overloaded. He pulled the brim of his battered hat lower, trying to make himself as inconspicuous as possible. Nokosi, however, moved through the crowd with a calm, quiet authority that commanded respect. He was known here. Men of all kinds nodded to him, their greetings a mixture of deference and genuine friendship. He was a trusted figure in this volatile world, a man whose word was his bond. Their destination was the main trading post building, the domain of Beau Dubois. Beau was a giant of a man, a French-Canadian with a booming laugh, a wild, black beard that seemed to consume the lower half of his face, and eyes that twinkled with a shrewd, world-weary intelligence. He was dressed in a beaded hide vest over a once fine linen shirt, a man who, like Nokosi, straddled two worlds with an easy grace. "Nokosi, my friend," Beau bellowed, his voice filling the cavernous, dimly lit trading post. He enveloped the Cheyenne hunter in a bare hug that would have crushed a smaller man. "It is too long. Your spirit has been a stranger to this place." He then looked at Daniel, his twinkling eyes taking in the boy's thin frame, his ragged clothes, and the haunted, wary look in his eyes. "And who is this young sparrow you have brought with you?" "This is Daniel," Nokosi said simply. "He is under my protection. We need a place to rest, Beau, and a place to listen." Beau's expression immediately became serious. He understood the coded language of the frontier. Under your protection meant the boy was in trouble. A place to listen meant they were hunting, or being hunted. "Of course," Beau said, his voice dropping to a low, confidential rumble. He led them through the crowded main room to a small, private chamber in the back, a cozy, cluttered space that served as his office and living quarters. "You are welcome here for as long as you need. No one will trouble you." He looked at Daniel with a compassionate eye. "The boy looks like he has seen a ghost." "He has seen many," Nokosi said grimly. Over the next few days, Three Rivers became their base of operations. While Daniel slowly regained his physical strength, eating hot, regular meals of stew and fresh-baked bread, Nokosi moved through the trading post like a master spy, gathering information. He would sit for hours with the old mountain men, sharing a pipe and listening to their trail gossip. He would trade with the Crow, speaking in the fluid, graceful sign language of the plains, learning of the movements of men in the surrounding territories. He was piecing together a puzzle, building a map of the Red Scorpion's operations from the scattered whispers and rumors that flowed through this place like the rivers outside. Daniel, meanwhile, was assigned his own task. Beau, a man of surprising kindness beneath his rough exterior, put him to work in the trading post. His job was to stack crates, sweep the floors, and help weigh furs. The simple, physical labor was good for him, keeping his mind from dwelling on the past. More importantly, it made him a part of the background, an invisible presence in the center of the information hub. He learned to keep his eyes open and his mouth shut, listening to the conversations of the rough men who came in to trade. He began to hear things. Whispers about the Red Scorpions. They were a large, well-armed gang, led by a man named Silas Kane, a former Confederate officer known for his cunning and his absolute ruthlessness. Men called him the Sidewinder because he was quiet, fast, and deadly. Their base was rumored to be in an old, abandoned mining camp in the lawless hills to the south, a place called Scorpion's Gulch. They had recently come into a great deal of money, men said, after clearing out a wagon train on the Oregon Trail. One afternoon, a grizzled, one-eyed prospector came in, his voice loud with whiskey and indignation. "Damn Sidewinder Kane and his whole crew," the man slurred, slamming his empty mug on the counter. "Their claim jumping all over the territory. Heard they're working for some big shot railroad men back east, clearing the way for the new tracks. They ain't just outlaws, they're an army." That night, Daniel and Nokosi pieced together everything they had learned. The picture was becoming terrifyingly clear. The Red Scorpions were not just a band of common thieves. They were a private army, a tool of powerful men, engaged in a systematic campaign of terror and displacement. The map they had stolen from Daniel's father wasn't just about a single gold claim. It was likely a survey of the entire region, a key to controlling the land before the railroad arrived. "This is bigger than we thought," Nokosi said, his face grim in the lamplight of Bo's back room. "Cain is not a man who will be brought down by the people. He is a cancer on this land." As if to punctuate his words, the doors to the trading post burst open, and a young, terrified-looking soldier stumbled in, his blue uniform torn and stained with blood. "It's the Scorpions," he gasped, wild-eyed with panic. "They hit our payroll wagon, not 5 miles down the trail. They killed everyone. I'm the only one who got away." A cold, tense silence fell over the trading post. The Scorpions were close. They were getting bolder, more brazen. They were no longer a distant threat whispered about by travelers. They were a clear and present danger, right on their doorstep. Daniel looked at Nokosi, and he saw a new, hard light in the Cheyenne's eyes. The time for listening was over. The time for hunting was about to begin. The beast had a name and a location. And now, it had shown its teeth once too often. The news of the payroll attack galvanized the small, chaotic community at Three Rivers. Fear and anger warred in the main room of the trading post. The fort commander, a young, by-the-book captain, would surely send a punitive patrol, but everyone knew it would be a futile gesture. The Scorpions would melt back into the hills long before the slow-moving soldiers could find them. Silas Sidewinder Cain operated with an impunity that bred a deep, resentful helplessness in the law-abiding folk of the territory. For Daniel, the attack was a catalyst. The raw and focused anger he had been nursing for weeks began to sharpen, to temper itself into a hard, cold point. He saw the terror in the young soldier's eyes and saw a reflection of his own. He was tired of being the one who ran, the one who hid. That night, he found Nokosi sitting alone outside, looking up at the vast, star-filled sky. The Cheyenne was in a state of deep, quiet contemplation. "You're going after them," Daniel said. It wasn't a question. Nokosi didn't look at him. "The world is out of balance," he said, his voice a low murmur. "This man, this Cain, he is a disease. If he is not cut out, the land will sicken and die." "I'm going with you," Daniel stated, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. Nokosi finally turned his head, his dark eyes studying the boy's face in the moonlight. He saw the new hardness there, the steel that had been forged in the fire of his grief. He saw that the boy he had rescued from the cave was gone, replaced by a young man who was now, for better or worse, a product of this harsh and forgiving land. "The trail to Scorpion's Gulch is a dangerous one," Nokosi warned, "and what we will find at the end of it is a nest of killers. This is not your fight, Daniel. I can take you to the fort at Laramie. You will be safe there. You can go back east, start a new life." He was offering him a final way out. "I tried that life," Daniel replied, his voice quiet but filled with a conviction that surprised even himself. "My family tried that life. Cain and his men burned it to the ground. There is no back east for me anymore. My life is here, now, on this trail, with you. You taught me how to survive, Nokosi. Now, teach me how to fight." A long, profound silence settled between them. Nokosi saw the truth of the boy's words. He could not send him away. He had saved Daniel's life, and in doing so, had made himself responsible for his spirit. To deny him this path would be to deny him the chance to reclaim his own soul from the ashes of the massacre. Nokosi gave a slow, solemn nod. "To be a hunter," he said, "is not just to know how to kill. It is to know why. It is to have a purpose that is stronger than your fear. Your purpose is strong, but your skills are weak. We must change that." The week that followed was the hardest of Daniel's life. Nokosi became a relentless, demanding instructor. He took Daniel deep into the wilderness surrounding the trading post and began the process of forging him into a warrior. The training was brutal and comprehensive. Nokosi started with the knife, teaching Daniel the fluid, deadly art of Cheyenne close-quarters combat. It was a dance of feints, parries, and devastatingly efficient strikes. He pushed Daniel to exhaustion, until the boy's muscles screamed and his lungs burned, teaching him to fight not just with his body, but with his mind. to see his opponent's moves before they were made. He moved on to the bow. He made Daniel craft his own from a tough, flexible piece of ashwood, and fletch his own arrows. A gun is a loud, stupid tool, Nokosi explained. It speaks only of death. A bow. A bow is an extension of the hunter's spirit. It can be silent. It can be patient. It can be a tool of life, to bring food, or a tool of balance to bring justice. Daniel, whose hands were more accustomed to the pages of a book, struggled. His fingers ran blistered. But he did not complain. He slowly, painstakingly, learned the art of the silent weapon. Finally, Nokosi trained him with the rifle, the tool of the new world. But he did not teach him to be a brawler, firing wildly from the hip. He taught him to be a sniper, a hunter. They spent hours on a high ridge, practicing long-distance shooting, learning to account for the wind, the drop of the bullet, the movement of a target. One shot, Nokosi would repeat, his voice a low mantra. One shot is all a true hunter needs. More than that is just noise. During this intense training, Daniel's body and spirit were reforged. The soft, focused boy from Ohio disappeared, burned away by the relentless physical and mental demands. His frame, which had been thin and gaunt, began to fill out with lean, hard muscle. His eyes, which had been haunted and fearful, now held a new, calm, watchful intensity. He was becoming a reflection of his mentor, a unique fusion of two worlds. He had the quiet patience of the Cheyenne and the grim, cold resolve of a man who had seen the worst of the white man's world. Their preparations were not just physical. Bodu Boyce, who had fully committed himself to their cause, helped them gather intelligence and supplies. He learned from a drunken teamster that the Scorpions were planning another big raid, this time on a gold shipment leaving the Sweetwater mines. The raid was set to happen in 3 days at a place called Crowheart Butte. It was an ambush, and it was the opportunity they had been waiting for. They will be focused on the gold, Nokosi said, as they studied a map in Bo's back room. Their guard will be down. We will not attack the main force. That would be foolish. We will hit their camp at Scorpion's Gulch while the best of their fighters are away. We will be the ambush within the ambush. The plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal. They would be 2 men, striking at the heart of the enemy's lair. But it was their only chance. On the final night, Nokosi gave Daniel a small, leather pouch. My son would have had his manhood ceremony this year, he said, his voice thick with a rare display of emotion. He would have become a warrior. You have faced the fire that should have been his. You have earned this. Daniel opened the pouch. Inside was a single, perfect eagle feather, and a small, smooth stone, a warrior's charm for strength and focus. It was the highest honor a Cheyenne could bestow. Daniel, his throat tight, could only nod his thanks. He was no longer just Daniel Miller, the boy who had survived. He was now, in spirit, a Cheyenne warrior, a hunter forged in the crucible of loss, on a trail that would lead him to the heart of the beast. Scorpion's Gulch was a scar on the face of the land. It was an old, failed mining camp, a collection of dilapidated, sun-bleached shacks and rotting timber frameworks clinging to the sides of a narrow, dusty canyon. A foul, stagnant creek, poisoned by the mine's long-abandoned tailings, trickled through the center. It was a place that radiated a palpable aura of greed, failure, and despair, a fitting lair for Silas Kane and his red scorpions. Daniel and Nokosi lay on a high, rocky ridge overlooking the camp, their bodies concealed by a thicket of gnarled, windswept juniper. They had traveled for 2 days, moving only at night, and had been in position since before dawn, observing, waiting. Down below, the camp was a hive of activity. As their intelligence had suggested, the majority of the Scorpions, at least 30 men led by Kane himself, had ridden out at sunrise, heading east towards Crowheart Butte and the gold shipment. They had left behind a skeleton crew of about 10 men to guard the camp. These were the dregs of the gang: the old, the young, the drunk, and the lazy. They were careless, confident that no one would dare attack the heart of their fortress. The beast has left its den unguarded, Nokosi whispered, his eyes scanning the layout of the camp below. Their arrogance will be their undoing. They had spent the morning planning their assault, a prolonged attack designed to maximize chaos and confusion. Their goals were simple and brutal: to destroy the Scorpion supplies, to free their stolen horses, and to find the map that had cost Daniel's family their lives. Killing was a secondary objective, a necessary consequence, but not the primary purpose. This was an attack on the gang's ability to operate, a crippling blow aimed at their very heart. They waited until the sun was at its highest point, a time when the heat was at its most oppressive and the guards were at their laziest, seeking shade and solace in a bottle of whiskey. Then, they began. They separated, Nokosi moving like a shadow along the northern ridge of the canyon, Daniel circling around to the south. Their attack would be coordinated, a hammer and anvil strike. Nokosi was the hammer. He moved into a position directly overlooking the largest building in the camp, a ramshackle structure that served as a combination saloon and storehouse. From his pouch, he took out the tools of his trade, a bow, and a single, specially prepared arrow. The arrowhead was wrapped in a small, oil-soaked piece of hide. With a flint and steel, he lit the tip, which began to smolder, producing a thick, acrid smoke. He drew the bow, took aim at the dry, timbered roof of the storehouse, and let the arrow fly. The smoking arrow arced through the hot, still air and buried itself in the tinder dry shingles of the roof. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a small, dark wisp of smoke began to curl upwards, followed by a tiny, hungry orange flame. At the same time, from the opposite side of the canyon, Daniel initiated the second part of the attack. He was positioned above the large corral where the scorpions kept their horses, including the fine animals stolen from the wagon train. He fired his rifle, not at the men, but at the heavy wooden crossbar that barred the corral gate. The first shot splintered the wood. The second shattered it completely. He then fired 2 more shots into the air and let out a piercing, wild yell. The effect on the camp was instantaneous and total. Down below, a man shouted, "Fire! The storehouse is on fire!" At the same moment, the horses in the corral, spooked by the rifle shots and the smell of smoke, panicked. They whinnied in terror and bolted through the now open gate, a thunderous, chaotic stampede of horseflesh that charged directly through the center of the camp. The 10 guards were thrown into a state of absolute pandemonium. They ran from the shacks, confused, half-drunk, not knowing whether to fight the fire, stop the stampede, or find the source of the attack. They were a disorganized, headless mob. This was the moment Nokosi and Daniel had been waiting for. From their concealed positions on the ridges, they opened fire. They did not fire into the chaos of the main camp. They had chosen their targets with care. 2 guards, who had run to a watchtower, were taken down by Nokosi's deadly, long-range accuracy. Daniel, his heart pounding but his hands steady, focused on the men trying to rally near a large tent at the edge of the campaign's personal quarters, where the map was most likely to be. He fired, not with the speed of a gunfighter, but with the deliberate, patient aim of a hunter, forcing the men to scramble for cover. The camp was now a kill zone. The fire on the storehouse roof, fanned by a rising afternoon breeze, roared to life, engulfing the building in flames. The crackle of the fire, the screams of the panicked men, and the sporadic, deadly crack of the 2 unseen rifles created a symphony of destruction. Under the cover of the chaos he had created, Nokosi slipped down from the ridge and entered the camp. He moved like a spirit of vengeance, his knife and tomahawk in his hands. He was not a sniper now, he was a close-quarters fighter, and he was in his element. He dispatched 2 of the scrambling, disorganized guards with a silent, brutal efficiency, melting back into the smoke and shadows before anyone even knew he was there. Daniel, his own task clear, provided covering fire. He saw one of the scorpions, a young kid who couldn't have been older than himself, trying to make a run for the rocks. Daniel tracked him with his rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger. He saw the boy's face, the pure terror in his eyes. He hesitated. In that moment of hesitation, the boy slipped and fell, dropping his gun. He looked up at Daniel's position, his hands raised in a gesture of pure, pathetic surrender. Daniel lowered his rifle. He was a hunter, not a butcher. His main focus was Kane's tent. 3 guards were still using it as a rallying point. While their attention was focused on finding Nokosi in the smoke, Daniel took a deep breath and left his protected position. He scrambled down the rocky slope, his rifle in his hands, his heart in his throat. This was the moment of greatest risk. He burst into the camp, surprising the 3 remaining men. He fired from the hip, the shot going wide, but it served its purpose. The men spun around, their eyes wide with shock at seeing him. Before they could bring their guns to bear, Nokosi emerged from the smoke behind them like an avenging demon. The fight was over in a flurry of swift, deadly motion. The camp was theirs. The fire was now consuming the storehouse, and a series of loud explosions rocked the canyon as the flames reached the Scorpion's main supply of ammunition. The last few surviving guards, seeing that the fight was lost, had fled into the wilderness. Without wasting a moment, Daniel ran to Kane's tent. He ripped open the flap and began to search frantically. The tent was lavishly appointed, a testament to the Sidewinder's vanity. On a small, makeshift desk, amidst a clutter of papers and whiskey bottles, he found it. Rolled in a leather tube and sealed with wax was his father's map. He clutched it to his chest, a wave of profound, overwhelming emotion washing over him. He had done it. He had reclaimed the last, tangible piece of his family's legacy. He emerged from the tent to find Nokosi calmly reloading his rifle, his face grim and smoke-stained. The battle was won, but they both knew the war was not over. Kane and the rest of the Scorpions would be returning, and when they found their lair destroyed and their men dead, their rage would be terrible to behold. "We have what we came for," Nokosi said, his voice a low, urgent command. "Now we disappear." They rounded up 2 of the best horses that hadn't fled, and without a backward glance at the burning, smoke-choked ruin of Scorpion's Gulch, they rode north, melting back into the vast, silent wilderness that was their only true ally. The ride from the smoldering ruins of Scorpion's Gulch was a grim, silent affair. There was no elation in their victory, only the cold, hard reality of what they had done and what was yet to come. They had kicked the hornet's nest, and they knew the full, furious swarm would now be hunting them with a singular, venomous purpose. They pushed their new, fresh horses hard, riding north towards the relative safety of the thick forests and rugged peaks of the Bighorn Mountains. Daniel clutched the leather tube containing his father's map, the object that had started this all. It felt both impossibly heavy and miraculously light in his hands. It was the cause of his family's death, but it was also the last remnant of their dream, and now, it was a symbol of his own survival and defiance. When Silas Sidewinder Kane and his men returned from their successful, bloody raid on the gold shipment, they did not find a triumphant camp ready to celebrate their spoils. They found a scene of utter devastation. Their storehouse was a blackened, smoking shell. Their stolen horses were scattered to the 4 winds, and their comrades were dead or missing, their bodies left where they had fallen. Kane, a man whose rage was usually a cold, controlled thing, lost control. His fury was a terrifying, volcanic eruption. He was not just a leader whose base had been destroyed, he was a king whose castle had been sacked, an apex predator who had been wounded and humiliated on his own territory. The attack was not just a strategic blow, it was a profound, personal insult. His rage quickly cooled into a deadly, obsessive focus. He found the tracks of the 2 horses leading north. He knew, with an unshakable certainty, who was responsible: the ghost, the Cheyenne hunter, and the boy he had failed to kill. "They will not escape me," Kane vowed to his remaining men, his voice a low, venomous whisper. "I will follow them to the frozen north if I have to. I will hunt them down, and I will show them a new kind of pain. I will take back what is mine, and I will burn the world down around them." The hunt began. Kane, driven by his wounded pride and cold fury, became a relentless, tireless pursuer. He was a skilled tracker in his own right, and with his best men, he set off on the trail, pushing his riders to the limits of their endurance. Daniel and Nokosi knew they were being followed. They could feel it, a prickling on the back of their necks, a sense of being watched. Nokosi, reading the signs of their pursuers' pace of their tracks, the way they didn't stop to make camp, knew that they were facing a man driven by more than just greed. They were being hunted by a man obsessed. The chase became a desperate, grueling week-long odyssey through the high country. It was a battle of wits and endurance. Nokosi used every ounce of his skill and knowledge of the terrain to evade and misdirect their pursuers. He led them through rushing rivers to hide their tracks, through dense, tangled forests where a posse could not move quickly, and over high, treacherous mountain passes. Daniel, for his part, was no longer a liability. He was a partner. His senses, honed by Nokosi's training, were sharp. He learned to spot the natural flight of a bird that signaled men passing below. He learned to distinguish the sound of a shod horse from the step of an elk. He was a second set of eyes and ears, a vigilant, tireless watchman. They were pushed to their limits. They slept in short, fitful bursts, ate on the move, and felt the constant, grinding pressure of the hunt. But in the crucible of this shared danger, their bond was tempered into something unbreakable. They were no longer just mentor and student. They were a single, functioning unit, two parts of a whole, their skills and strengths complementing each other perfectly. The final confrontation came in a high alpine valley, a place of stark, stunning beauty, with a crystal-clear lake and meadows filled with wildflowers. They had thought they had finally lost their pursuers, and had stopped to rest their exhausted horses and themselves. It was a fatal, momentary lapse in their vigilance. Cain and his 5 best men, having made a final, desperate push, cornered them in the valley. There was no escape. The only way out was a narrow pass, which was now blocked. "It seems the trail has finally ended, Ghost," Cain's voice echoed across the valley, cold and triumphant. He and his men were positioned on the rocks above, their rifles aimed down at the 2 trapped figures. Nokosi and Daniel took cover behind a jumble of granite boulders near the lake's edge. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmaneuvered. "So this is where the balance is restored," Nokosi said, his voice calm, as he checked the action on his rifle. He showed no fear, only a quiet, fatalistic acceptance. Daniel looked at the Cheyenne who had become his only family. He thought of his parents, of Lily. He thought of the map, still tucked safely in his shirt. He would not let it end here. "No," Daniel said, a desperate, audacious plan forming in his mind. "The valley is the trap. Not for us. For them." He pointed to the far side of the lake, where a large and stable-looking cliff face of loose rock and scree rose hundreds of feet. "Their position is too strong. We can't fight them up there. But maybe we can bring the mountain down on them." Nokosi looked from the cliff face to Daniel, and he saw the wild, improbable genius of the plan. It was a desperate gamble, a 1 in a million shot, but it was their only chance. He gave a single, sharp nod. The student had become the strategist. The plan was born of desperation and an intimate knowledge of the land. While Nokosi laid down a precise, harassing fire, forcing Cain and his men to keep their heads down, Daniel began a perilous journey. He slipped into the icy waters of the lake and, using the overhanging bank for cover, swam to the far side. It was a grueling, lung-burning swim, but the cold water shocked his weary body into a state of hyper-awareness. He reached the base of the scree slope, a massive and stable wall of loose rock and gravel, held in place by what looked like a few key geological trigger points. It was a natural avalanche, waiting to happen. He began to climb, his hands and feet finding purchase on the treacherous surface, his heart pounding with exertion and fear. From the rocks above, Cain and his men were growing frustrated. Nokosi's fire was unnervingly accurate, a single rifle sounding like 3, keeping them pinned down and able to get a clear shot at their targets. "Where's the boy?" Cain snarled, peering over the edge. He saw a flicker of movement on the scree slope across the valley. "There? The little rat is trying to climb out." He raised his rifle. "He's mine." He took aim. But just as he was about to fire, Nokosi's rifle cracked, and the rock just beside Cain's head exploded in a shower of granite dust. Cain jerked back with a curse, momentarily blinded. That was the moment Daniel reached his goal. He found what he had been looking for, a large, precariously balanced keystone rock that seemed to be holding a major section of the slope in place. Using a long, dead pine branch as a lever, he put all of his weight, all of his anger, all of his grief, into one, final, desperate push. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, groaning shudder that seemed to come from the heart of the mountain itself, the keystone shifted. A few small pebbles cascaded down. Then, the entire cliff face seemed to dissolve. With a deafening, thunderous roar, a river of rock and gravel began to pour down the mountainside. It was not a landslide, it was an explosion of stone, a tidal wave of earth that swept down towards the position where Cain and his men were crouched. They had no time to react. They looked up, their faces masks of pure, unbelieving terror, as the mountain came down upon them. The roar of the avalanche was the last sound they ever heard. The dust and echoes slowly settled, leaving a profound, ringing silence in the valley. The entire landscape had been changed. The ridge where the scorpions had been was gone, buried under thousands of tons of rock. Daniel lay panting at the top of the slope, his body bruised and scraped, but alive. He looked across the valley at Nokosi, who slowly rose from behind his cover. Their eyes met across the distance, a silent acknowledgement of the impossible thing they had just done. The immediate threat was over. The red scorpions were gone, their leader buried under a mountain of his own making. The balance was restored. In the days that followed, they made their way slowly out of the mountains. They were weary, bruised, but they were survivors. They were free. They stood at last on a high pass, looking west. Before them, the land sloped down into the vast, green river valleys of the Oregon Territory. The Promised Land. Daniel took out the map. He looked at the careful, spidery script of his father's hand, at the lines that led to a place of dreams. He then looked at Nokosi, the man who had saved him, the man who had become his family. "What now?" Nokosi asked, his voice quiet. "Your father's land is that way. Your journey is over." Daniel looked at the map, then back at the endless and tamed wilderness that stretched in every direction. He thought of his family, of the price that had been paid for this piece of paper. The gold no longer mattered. The land was not just a place on a map, it was a memory, a legacy. "No," Daniel said, a slow, sure smile spreading across his face. "Our journey is just beginning." He did not know what the future held. The world was still a wild and dangerous place. The ghost of his sister, Lily, was still an unanswered question, a faint trail he knew he would one day have to follow. But he was not a victim anymore. He was a hunter, a survivor, a man forged between two worlds. He and Nokosi turned their horses, not towards the specific valley on the map, but towards the vast, open horizon. They were two solitary figures, a Cheyenne warrior and the boy he had raised from the ashes, bound by a shared past of tragedy and a shared future of unwritten possibility. Their trail was their own to make, a new story of hope and survival, whispered on the winds of the wild and tamed West.